This is the Dean Abbott podcast. Today I'm talking to Dr. Philip Bunn, who's assistant professor of political science at Covenant College. How's it going, Dr. Bunn?
It's going well. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to chat with you.
We know one another, just like I know many of the guests I have on here from Twitter. How are things going on Twitter for you?
They've been interesting. I've been a bit more active there recently with some current events kinds of things, and I've always enjoyed Twitter. I've had it for quite some time. I find it very engaging, and I have made some really good friends on there, like you and some other people in circles that we run in. So I find that a good 90% of my time on Twitter is actually very engaging, even productive. It's led to some writing opportunities and to some new friendships. But then that 10% of the time where it's just sort of yelling at strangers on the internet, that's probably the portion of my Twitter usage that could stand to be moderated, I think.
You don't find yelling at strangers on the internet to be a worthwhile pursuit?
I find it entertaining, and it's one of the reasons I keep doing it. But I think that it's tends to frustrate me more than it accomplishes anything of value most of the time.
I have noticed one common trait of the kind of people who yell at me on Twitter is a high level of entitlement, where they believe they are entitled to have me talk to them all day long and to argue with them, and that I owe them an explanation. And I've been on Twitter long enough to have a sense of just being able to revel in the fact that I, in fact, do not owe you an explanation. I can tweet the most cryptic thing in the world, and if you misunderstand it, it's not my job to make sure you do.
That's a very good perspective. I could probably stand to adopt some of that. I think one of the traps that I fall into in online spaces, some people will describe it as being one guide, as in like you're talking and maybe you look at, if it's like a live stream, you look at the chat or you're tweeting and you read one of your responses and there's this one person who says something particularly dumb and you fixate on that at the expense of everything else. So I tend to get one guide in this way, where I'll see someone with a particularly frustrating misunderstanding of my point, or say something particularly nasty, and I'll want to engage them and fix them. And quite often that's not that's not possible. So
you get to a place, I guess, where you just end up writing for the people who understand.
Yeah,
that's probably the best. I don't think your account is particularly partisan or inflammatory.
It's usually not. I'll occasionally say things that I don't expect to be particularly provocative that end up being provocative. One of the things like this that happened recently was sort of a cultural commentary thing. There was an article in a literary magazine about why men don't read more novels, more fiction. And I sort of reposted this and said, well, I think you can get a clue as to why they don't if you just walk into any bookstore in America and look at probably the table that will greet you right when you walk in the door and the type of books that are on it. And of course, everybody's responses or something like, well, this is just, this is what women read. They read romances. These are the most popular books. So of course, these are the books they're going to advertise, which of course I know, but my point really was just that I think you can understand why a man who's looking to get into reading is not particularly drawn to the fiction that's kind of on display and shown as an example of what it means to be a bookish person or a reader, right? They tend to gravitate, when they do read, more to historical things, etc. I think it would be great if more men read fiction. I was just simply making the point that I think you can see in the industry and the way it's advertised that it's not catering to men. I'm not saying it has to, but you should be able to understand the answer to the question of why men don't read fiction is it's not made for them in many cases. And people were very mad about that. And I was kind of surprised actually at sort of the scope and scale of the backlash that I received.
A while back, I worked in a small community library, and month after month, I would put out the new books. And I began to wonder if there were any men writing novels in America, because literally 90% of them would all be written by women. Yeah. I'm sure there are men who are writing novels somewhere in America.
They write some historical fiction, and they certainly write thrillers and things, and but yeah, it's certainly I think it's a female dominated industry, both in terms of writing and readership, at least in fiction. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure that, like every other part of our cultural life, there is a malaise in the production of serious literary fiction, and that it's probably mostly at this point dominated by what we would call the woke, and that you're getting some kind of Dostoevsky or even Hemingway out there is a tough one right now. I don't know who's putting out those books.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's, I don't have sort of a principled objection to some of the things that would maybe get lumped into the woke category. Like, I think it's probably interesting and good that more people from a variety of backgrounds are writing about their experiences, with characters that look like them and have the backgrounds that they do. That's probably good. And I've enjoyed reading books that sort of fit into that. But it does seem that the people who sort of are at the helm of the industry are looking for that kind of stuff exclusively or predominantly, maybe at the expense of some people who write really interesting literature in that sort of old style. I mean, and again, like, I don't want to pretend those things don't exist, right? One of the other responses I got was, well, there's plenty of books for you. Like, you can go read if you want to be the kind of guy who reads the Dostoevskys and the Hemingways, you can still do that. Of course, I think that's great. We should read old books, but isn't it nice sometimes when there's new stuff that comes out that's quite good? I think there are good people that I've tried to find through Twitter. Aaron Gwynn is one of these people. He's a literature professor in the University of North Carolina system, I believe, and he's written a lot of short fiction. He has a novella coming out next year that looks very interesting that I'm looking forward to reading. So I know these people exist. They write good stuff, and I want more of them, and I want more men to be patronizing them. Yeah.
When I talk about literature that is dominated by wokeism, I don't necessarily mean it's more the number of authors is more diverse and the number of characters is more diverse. What I mean is literature that is dominated by a worldview that is primarily political rather than moral. Do you understand what I mean by the distinction?
Yes, I think so. I had this experience recently. There's a fantasy author that some people were telling me I should read, R.F. Kuang. She wrote another, like, a more literary fiction book recently outside of the genre of fantasy. She wrote the Poppy War trilogy, and then there was this book that was recommended to me called Babel, and I enjoyed it quite a lot, but I could not escape the feeling that I was sort of being beaten over the head with a kind of political message the entire time. It was hard to escape. And so I'm sure, again, the kind of critics I had in this Twitter thread would say, well, the Hemingway and the Dostoevsky stuff is political in some form or fashion, and I'd agree to some extent, but it's different. It's quite different to me than the sort of, in this book particularly, it was sort of like repeatedly being beaten over the head with oppressed class distinctions and things like this. That was the sort of driving force of the narrative, as opposed to anything sort of more exploratory about a general human condition or what have you. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What does it mean to have a political worldview?
That's interesting. I think I would tend to associate those worldviews with what often get called like ideologies. I mean, I think something that was very shaping for me on this is a political philosopher, Eric Voegelin, talks about a set of ideologies that he calls Gnosticism, not the sort of particular form of the old Christian heresy, but any sort of ideology that thinks they've accessed some sort of secret knowledge, that all of reality can be interpreted through the lens of that secret knowledge, and we can, through some human intervention, bring some sort of ideal into history here and now. And so into this, he puts obviously things like Marxism and ideologies like that. And so I think when people tend to think in those terms, they're very totalizing. Everything in life comes to be viewed through this, I would consider it fairly narrow lens, right? We have a materialistic explanation of history or an ideological explanation of history, and we follow that through kind of at the expense of other more, I would say, like sort of deeply human motivations about, life and love and faith and all these other things that I think play in perhaps more than these sort of grand historical narratives that some of these ideologies develop. So that's sort of how I would think about it, maybe. But I don't know. Maybe you have some good insight there.
No, I think that is. I have written often on Twitter about this notion of ideology. I think I'm very concerned about it from the point of view, from a sort of a more psychological and spiritual point of view, and the way that it facilitates the development of a false self. And I was just recording a podcast, the last episode, with Andrew Snyder, who's a philosopher that I know you know. And one of the things that came up, we talked a lot about Jacques Ellul and Ellul's notion of propaganda as this almost carpeting, totally comprehensive substitute for religion, which is an ideology, and how to sort of live within that propagandistic system, the human person has to disavow what we know to be true in our guts. And this is part of kind of the creation of the false self. And I think it's worth noting, too, that a person can be ideological in a very strict sense, but not materialistic. So I think of certain expressions of Christianity, I suppose very fundamentalist ones and very progressive ones, that sort of think that Christianity is a tool for them to enact some other agenda, which is utopian if only everyone would get on board. Whether that is a sort of Bill Gothard approach to, if everyone would learn my rules and follow them, the world would be perfect, or if it's a sort of a far left Christianish expression of more or less standard leftist utopianism. Both of those are a way of hijacking Christianity, I think, for an ideological purpose, whereas what I would consider more kind of non-ideological Christianity is a Christianity that is incomplete as an intellectual system insofar as its fundamental point is toward mystery. And it brings you to the end of what you know far before it becomes a totalizing system. And it drives you into a sort of humility because of what you do not know.
Yeah, I like that. I think the Gothard example is really good there because there's something about that approach to Christianity that is very formulaic. You know, he would stand up in his sermons and give anecdotes that were supposed to sort of be proof test cases for, you know, if you do this thing this way, right? If you start praying over this stronghold in your life, or if you get rid of that, you know, rock record that's a source of demonic influence in your home, here's what will result. It's a sort of plug and play, like totalizing, like if you follow these simple steps kind of thing. It reminds me of I'm not capital O Orthodox. I'm Protestant, but I enjoy listening sometimes to a podcast called Lord of Spirits that my Orthodox friends have recommended to me. And they did an episode on technology and magic a while back, and one of the things that they're talking about in their understanding of magic and how it was practiced, you know, the kind of magic or wizardry or witchcraft that's being talked about in the Old Testament, particularly, is this view of the world that says there's something mechanistic out here that if I do the right rituals with the right ingredients, say the right thing in the right time, in the right place, in the right season, I can make something happen. It's kind of a source of power in a way. And I think for some people, political ideology has become something like that. That's just like I've unlocked the secret and I can make something happen if I plug the right pieces into place and recite the right political formulas at the right time, you know, the right land acknowledgments and the right identity characteristics or what have you, right? So,
as we are talking, we are just 24 hours removed from the end of the 2024 presidential election. So you've probably had some real life politics in the news that you've been thinking about and talking about with your classes. But I wanted to ask you a deeper question, which is, what is politics in the first place?
Yeah, I think of politics as sort of the art of learning to live together in community and peace, which is a very broad thing, but I think it is relatively all encompassing. If you talk about politics in the strictest sense, right, literally just means in the Greek, things relating to the polis or the city, the political community, and that is sort of all encompassing, right? So if you just look at what Aristotle considers political in his politics, it's everything. It's education, it's formation of character, and it's the things we think of as politics, the actual voting and policy making and what have you. And so the way I explain when I'm teaching, sort of political theory to students is I think there's an entry point for everyone into a theoretical examination of politics in the sense that not precisely in the same way that some people might say like everything is political or the personal is political, but that there are sort of political dimensions to almost everything we can imagine that involves life together and community. So sports and education and all these other things have political facets to them that I think are interesting to sort of wrestle with. And that's what I try to drag students into in my more like theoretical classes. Yeah.
Is politics inherently and basically concerned with power?
I tend to characterize it as being concerned with peace primarily. That there's something about politics that's oriented towards that, flourishing human life and community that entails some sort of exercise of power. But I tend to intellectually and spiritually resist the what I think of as a fairly modern way of thinking about politics. Like I think from Hobbes on, really about politics basically being the exercise of power to rid ourselves of fear and insecurity and instability, or the sort of Weberian view that the state is the monopoly on legitimate use of force in a defined area. That I think those are useful things to study, but I think it's sort of less than half the interesting material. And I think some people sort of get fixated on the power part at the expense of the goals or the ends of it. Yeah.
So let me play devil's advocate a little bit here to draw this out. Isn't it the case that if there weren't a question of power, we wouldn't need to learn to live together? Because what complicates our living together is that we not just that we have individual power to affect change in the world, but the question of power over. We have that as soon as we come together to live in a group, the question of one or more having power over others arises, it seems to me. And so isn't the question of having who will have power over whom, isn't that fundamental to what it means to be political?
Yeah, I think it's I would say it's an intrinsic part of how we think about politics, especially living as we do in a post-fall world. But I would view it as sort of like a couple steps down the line of the political questions I would want to ask. So one of the very like shaping perspectives on fundamental questions of politics I've had came from my grad school advisor, who I imagine got it from his grad school advisor, who was Father James Shaw at Georgetown. My advisor was Richard Avermenko. And the way he would teach political theory was that he would open students to these, what he called two fundamental questions of politics, which in sort of like old timey phrasing were, what is the measure and how shall we be gathered? And the first question is one of standards or justice. What is the, literally the yardstick or the ruler that we use to determine who's a good person, who's a good citizen, who's a good man? And the second question of how shall we be gathered is what binds us or unites us together? And I think one possible answer to that question is just power. It's the sort of Weberian answer that's like you have, defined monopoly on force in this area, with borders and boundaries, and that person gets to use power. And if you try to use power, they're going to hit you back with a bigger stick. There are other answers to that question, though, that we're bound together through ties of, common national heritage, common language, common family, right? You could have just sort of a familial structure. And so I think different answers to that question will have different sort of downstream implications for what uses of power are necessary and legitimate, but I would view them as sort of like derivative rather than fundamental, if that makes sense. That may not be an intuitive way of thinking about it.
Let me see if I understand what you're saying. Your answer is that the question of power over
Mhm.
others, when we begin to consider politics, you're saying it's not fundamental, but rather the fundamental questions when we begin to think about how we live together are questions of the good
Mhm.
and questions of our identity.
In some way, yeah, identity has its own ring today, but questions of,
Who are
I
we
would
and
call
what
it,
is good?
yeah. Who are we? What's all this for? And then when you answer those questions, I think, of course, like you're suggesting, there will be implications about power. Like when you come to an answer of like what is a good person and how do we know that, then you necessarily come to some conclusions about what is a bad person and what do we do with them. And so that will
Right.
have the implications
And the
of
people you
involving power.
are resisting are the people who say that those questions are simply answered by whoever has the power.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are people who sort of dispense with questions of capital G good, human good and human ends, and also who dispense with the idea even of really like political legitimacy. That well, it's sort of all power, and what's legitimate is just sort of what's constructed and agreed upon, and that's not really an important question. I would be, I think, pushing back against those people. Yeah.
Where do you where do you think if we can talk about the average American now, how do you see how do you see most Americans living politically now?
Um,
What do
the
you think are
first,
their basic assumptions?
yeah, the first thing that comes to mind is just a kind of basic cynicism. I think that the other side or the other camp, whatever camp you don't find yourself belonging to, is sort of out to get you, and that politics, to the extent that we practice it, is about making sure that either we don't let them get us, or that we get them before they get us. So that I think there's a sort of a fear that characterizes. I don't think it's totally fair to split things up on like an even line, one side and then the other side, only two sides in this game, but that's sort of how it feels at times with our partisan alignment. And I think both sides share this like cynicism and suspicion that the other group, through the policies they want to enact, really just deeply wants to use power to enact harm and then benefit themselves at the end of it. So that to me like feels in day-to-day conversation like the most common sentiment that I hear. Yeah.
Is that cynicism a result of having the traditional answers to those first two questions broken down?
I think so in some ways. And I mean, I think it's a long process to get here, right? I think anybody who thinks any, current contemporary political figure is like the origin of all of our ills, it probably needs a little bit more historical perspective. But I think it's, when you don't have good answers to like what makes us citizens in common, what makes us, Americans and good Americans, what do we share together, then yeah, things start breaking down fairly fast. And so I think if you just sat, people representative of sort of the extremes of the American right and the American left down and ask them individually, like, what do you think makes a good American? And how would you know? You might get some overlapping answers, but then when you ask them what they mean by those things like, fidelity to the founding or the Constitution or what have you, if they even believe in that, what that actually looks like and means and requires is going to be different between them. And I think that's where the rub comes in.
All right, so let me ask you this question, building off of that. It seems to me that if you are going to begin your political life by asking the questions, who are we and what is good,
Mm-hmm.
that those answers derive from some sort of accepted mythos,
Mm-hmm.
a narrative that people believe, and that gives legitimacy to those answers, to the answers to those questions. But a mythos only works so long as the majority of people are not aware of the fact that it is a mythos, right?
Mm-hmm.
As soon as we begin to think, oh, that's just a story, those answers become incredible. So once a people wake up to the idea that that the narrative from which those foundational answers derive, once they wake up from kind of thinking from that dream, shall we
Mm-hmm.
say, how do they ever go back to sleep in a way that allows them to once again agree on those fundamental answers?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's something I've been kind of wrestling with, I think, for a long time in a maybe kind of a related context, which is, there's lots of thinkers, and the one that comes to mind most for me, just because of the kind of stuff that I do, is Alexis de Tocqueville, who seem to think that like religion serves some sort of really important civic purpose, that sharing some sort of common faith, especially in modern democratic societies, does some real good to moderate the worst tendencies of those democratic societies. But at the same time, Tocqueville is depending on who you ask, but the most common answer is not a particularly strong man of faith himself. He doesn't think most of this stuff is true, capital T. And so to what extent, I think he's wrestling with, and we have to wrestle with, could you be someone like him who believes in the utility of religion, but also believes it's not true? And how can you hold those things in tension? Sort of as you're saying, when you come to believe it's not true, the usefulness tends to fade. I think one of the things I would say is, you have to believe, like, so I would say, in the American context, right? I think we have a founding mythos about what America is and is for, and these rights and liberties that we have. That's real, and it has been, I think, broken in some sense. You don't find a lot of sort of idealistic embracers of American founding principles in many circles anymore. But I think one thing that you have to believe if you want to restore the good of that, I don't know if I would call it going back to sleep, but is you actually have to believe that there is something sort of metaphysically true behind it all. So a book I just read recently that I think grappled with this really well was Francis Fukuyama has a 2003 book on biotechnology, and he's talking about how he anticipates things like neuropharmacological interventions changing our brains, and then eventually direct genetic engineering of offspring to change human equality. And so he talks about this idea that, like, human equality, as we see it in the Declaration of Independence and in Locke, is kind of a myth, right? We can look around us and see that we're not all equal in some way, but you have to believe, he thinks, that there is some fundamental equality between us, and that proposition is ultimately moral or metaphysical. You have to believe, even if you're a non-religious sort of evolutionist, whatever, like him, you have to believe that there's some ontological difference between human beings and not human beings that makes us all on a level playing field morally and legally. And when you lose that, maybe through differing ideologies that say, no, the king is metaphysically distinct than me, or through literally altering human genetics where some people are different types than others, which is what he fears most, you're losing that belief in what he takes, I think, to actually be metaphysically true, that there is some difference between humans and not humans that puts us all on this sort of level moral playing field. So I don't, that's a roundabout way to say, I'm not sure about the idea of like sort of going back to sleep. I do think you can have some sort of restoration of a belief in a mythos that gains sort of a quality of adherence over time when it's backed up by something that you do believe is like capital T true, rather than just like constructed and mythological, if that makes sense.
What if you, though, live in a political environment one of whose primary effects is to erode your capacity to believe that anything is capital T true?
Yeah. That I would say is bad. I think that might be, the source of a lot of our ills. And I'm not sure what you do in that situation, except come to realize, as I think a lot of people have, that there's something deeply unsatisfying about that. And so I don't know how confident you can be in these sorts of trends, but I know that there are various religious movements that are their adherents are suggesting they're seeing a lot of converts, people who are dissatisfied with the sort of secular materialism or whatever it is that they're coming from. I think that's an interesting sort of reaction against that. But if you have a society that fully and deeply embraces that, I think you're on a pretty rough path. And I don't know that I have a good solution. If I did, I would try to fix more things, I guess.
One of the recurring themes in this show, as I've been doing these interviews, is that whenever I talk to political types, I'm always trying to explore my fundamental question of whether or not liberalism has within it its own doom.
Yeah.
And I haven't yet talked to anyone who says yes. unequivocally.
Mm-hmm.
And the answer that you just gave is an answer that I hear often. I think I've heard before, which is maybe it does, but in America, maybe Christianity can save it,
Yeah.
essentially, right? And that may be true. I think it is maybe it's just a pessimistic view to think that liberalism involves a kind of inherent degradation of the sacred to a point where it spirals downward, in that the only thing that can restore the only thing that can, well, whether you want to say put people back to sleep or to wake people further up, I suppose is also, that's the metaphor you're talking about. Like if we say waking people further up means, oh, realizing there's something metaphysically true behind this.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the question I often have, my core political question is whether there's anything that would say wake people further up to a metaphysical truth behind their cultural narrative, other than a kind of total crash of the system. And everyone I've talked to is more optimistic than I am and says yes, yes, it is possible. And maybe it is. Maybe there's a level at which people become so dissatisfied that they want to begin on a personal level to sort of rewind kind of some of the ravages of the extremes of where liberalism has taken them.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'm granting that. But do you understand why the question and where I'm coming from?
Yeah, this is, I think, something also that's been on my brain for a long time. I feel like the thread of, critics of liberalism has been very strong in my education. I remember in my, I believe it was my modern and contemporary political thought class, junior year of undergrad. We read a reader that Oxford puts out on essays between these people in academic political theory and philosophy who had disputes about sort of the fundamental unit of analysis of politics. And so on the one hand, you had the communitarians who viewed the community as fundamental in analysis, and the other you had the individualists. And in the long game, the individualists kind of won out, the people who are more like Rawls than the Charles Taylors of the world, I guess. And then it was in 2016, I think, is when Rod Dreher's Benedict option came out, and then I started grad school, and then 2018 was when Patrick Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed came out. All of those were sort of like lurking in my brain, and I was very sympathetic to these criticisms. My undergrad advisor as well, Mark Mitchell, wrote a book called The Limits of Liberalism that I still find very compelling. His argument basically is that these liberal thinkers have lost the utility and truth of tradition, and he sort of traces that through the sort of origin points of liberalism as he sees them in people like Francis Bacon and Descartes, and then uses people like Michael Oakeshott and McIntyre to criticize them. And so, I'm very sympathetic to these criticisms. One reason why I chose sort of the path of research that I do, which focuses on liberal thinkers, was I was sort of trying to moderate my own pessimism. So I come to, Patrick Deneen, for example, and he says in his chapter on technology that liberalism has no principles within itself to have any sort of limitation on the development and use of technology. If you embrace freedom as a fundamental good, then there's nothing within this political system that could say, no, this is something that we ought not do for human good reasons. And I wasn't sure that was true. So I was like digging into these older liberal thinkers like Adam Smith and Tocqueville and John Stuart Mill to see if they had anything that they thought, within their own ideas would act as a limit on some of these principles. And so the way I've described it to some people is like, I am kind of pessimistic about liberalism. I would count myself in this camp of critics of liberalism. But if we're going to throw the liberal bathwater out, I want to make sure there's no baby in it first, right? Like maybe there isn't one, sure, and then we can throw it out, but I want to make sure that there isn't one. And I don't know if I've found a satisfying answer to that. I do think that one thing that the critics miss that I've realized over time, or that I would say I think they miss, is sort of the varieties and shades of liberalism that get very complicated. And so there's a really good book that came out about this a couple of years ago by Alan Cahan, who's a really good scholar of Tocqueville and Mill, and it's called Freedom from Fear, which he borrows from another liberal thinker, Judith Shklar. But it's a really good kind of intellectual history of liberalism that he puts into sort of various phases. I think he believes we've gone through kind of 3 phases of liberalism, and we're morphing into a 4th one that remains to sort of be seen what it's going to look like. And each of them have had different sort of characteristic thinkers, and each of them have had different levels to which they embrace what he calls the sort of 3 pillars of liberalism, which is markets, morals, and I believe political liberty is the 3rd one. But all of these thinkers in these various camps through these various ages have had different answers to, like, how do we preserve, healthy markets that are not just chaos? How do we preserve, the actual moral character of our liberal citizens? How do we preserve political liberty? And I think he makes a good case that within the tradition, there are good answers here that may have been lost along the way, that might be worth recovering. So yeah, that's kind of a roundabout way to say, I think I share some of your pessimism. I am still in the process, I think, of trying to talk myself out of it, trying to sort of find something to latch onto here that says, no, actually, this is not sort of inevitable. There is something within liberalism which has, I think, good things that we all benefit from that could sort of rescue itself. I'm not sure that that's true yet, but I want to believe that it's true, if that makes sense. Yeah.
I think one mistake that pessimistic critics of liberalism might make, I'm not sure about this, but it might be the case, that we tend to think that our political vision constitutes the whole of our culture. And that there might, in fact, be something outside of liberalism that remains part of our culture that could once again be inculcated into the population to serve as a restraint on the worst impulses of our political vision.
Yeah.
Now, maybe, even as I say it, I'm not convinced, but it's possible. And I suppose in America, that thing that would be outside of our liberal vision would be some sort of traditional religion.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe.
Yeah. Right. I think the 2 places I would look in the American tradition would be like, either traditional religion or, whatever heritage or influence we have from older political traditions that themselves have, I would call them, like, semi or quasi religious views of human character and human goods that sort of get folded in, like that there are influences in the American tradition from these older, Greek and Roman thinkers with substantive views of human goods, and sort of lost along the way, I think. But I think it's sort of the divide you see now in some intellectual competition between the more religious type thinkers and the more the people who want to lean into maybe the more pagan influences. Those divides exist, and I think they're both doing a project of trying to resuscitate and find resources in the tradition to inform our politics now. I, as a Protestant Christian, obviously prefer the religious recovery to the recovery of sort of, I don't know, Nietzschean paganism or whatever. But that's just me, I guess.
Where do you see the popular American political vision now going? Because so we started out talking about Twitter, and Twitter has been instrumental, and this is why the left tends to hate it. Twitter has been instrumental in the rise of what is called the new right. And the new right, I would say, tends to be irreligious, and probably have more of a basis in the kind of pagan thinkers that you're talking about. Or it tends to be just instinctively reactionary, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but you see it a lot with what we might call street level populism. And so So the question I'm trying to formulate as I'm rambling is the worldview that, for example, elected Trump, without getting into whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, the worldview that led to his election, is that the same worldview, the American worldview laid out by the founders, do you think, or is something different?
Hmm. Um, well, first, I guess on the new right stuff, I think you're right. There is a strong strain of this that is just like full on irreligious or even anti-religious that has, I think, a real disdain for what I take to be really true and fundamental principles of Christianity, like self-sacrifice and humility and things like this. I do have friends that I think would consider themselves on this new right who are, I think, good, strong Christians who like see something very important in this kind of like spirited or masculine recovery of a kind of politics that we've lost along the way. And so I'm still wrestling through some of this, like wanting to, some really excellent, smart, wonderful people I know are, I think, would sort of lean that direction. And so I'm still sort of working through what they find appealing that I don't necessarily, I guess. But I would say to the precise question, like, is this the spirit of the founders? I would say no. I think one thing that you find pretty consistently, I've been teaching a class on the political thought of the American founding for a couple of years now, and I think one thing you find pretty consistently in most of the writers around the sort of founding era and then the framers of the Constitution is a fear of what they call demagoguery or tyranny, which to them are very similar, which is the idea of this sort of, charismatic person who has kind of power in themselves, not sourced from the consent of the governed, but by virtue of the fact of their power and charisma and skill, that they're sort of able to take the reins here. I think that was a real fear for them, and I think that's why early in the American Republic you see a sort of minimized role of presidents compared to what you might expect from an executive at the top of a pretty powerful government. Not that we don't remember these people, we obviously do. Not that they didn't do important things, they obviously did. But that there is a real shift somewhere along the way where presidents start claiming some sort of direct public mandate rather than being executors of this sort of system that goes beyond them. And so I don't know that Trump fits very well into what I would consider a founding vision, except to the extent that certain founders were more comfortable with sort of singular power, strong executives, maybe the Hamiltons or what have you. But at the same time, I think we've had now nearly 10 years of people trying to figure out what makes Trump so appealing, and I wouldn't want to say that the people who find him appealing aren't in some way finding their support for him in their love of American principles. I think it's a sort of a negative or a backlash, I guess, against people that they think are sacrificing American principles and what's good for America, and then they're latching on to this person who ostensibly will be good for the things that they take to be good about America. But I don't think you get Trump if you are just sort of sourcing your vision of politics and what a good leader is from like founding era thought, unless you're honing it on some very narrow exceptions to the rule, I guess.
And so we can think about maybe what we would call the classic American political vision, which is different, I think, from both the progressive vision and the populist vision that we are currently in the middle of which are currently battling one another. And what happened to the traditional American political vision?
I think for many people, it feels like it was either too weak to stand up to its opponents, or it's been it's been sacrificed by people who they view as un-American or anti-American in some way, right? So I think a good number of strong Trump supporters would say that they are looking to, the slogan here of Make America Great Again, they really do view in a substantive way, that they're like, there was a time when America was great. It was lost through some period of policies and choices, maybe nefarious, maybe not, that led us to forsake those, and that we could recover that if we try. So I think some of those people are well intentioned. Like my difficulties with hopping on board the movement aside, like I understand, I think they're I'm sympathetic to some of the resentment, I guess. I understand a little bit of what drives this. Yeah, I don't know if that really answers the question, though.
Given the energy now behind MAGA populism and the rise of the new right, is progressivism done?
That's an interesting question. I think we're still sort of doing, obviously, the election postmortem, but some people I think have suggested and will continue to suggest that one of the failings of the Biden administration was its sort of open championing of more openly progressive causes, whether that's appointing visible minorities, which some people view as DEI or identity politics, or whether that's in the policies that they were supporting in terms of border or transgender or abortion issues. I think some people I think are jumping to say the party's embrace of those further left-leaning issues is what alienated some of this base that they needed to turn out to win the election. I think it will sort of remain to be seen if that's actually true or not. I think what's my intuition is that it's more likely that people tend to be very grumpy right now. And so what happens in 2016 is sort of people are not happy with the way things are at the end of the Obama presidency, and they go with somebody who's going to shake it up. 2020, people are not happy with the way things are in the middle of COVID and with the Trump presidency, and so they vote for the candidate who's going to shake things up. And I think we've seen something very similar in this election. So I think there are parts of the current American left that are still going to be strongly what we would call like progressive or ideological or woke or any of these things. I think there are people who want that, and they'll keep voting for it. Whether the party itself will view that as a tactical mistake and adjust accordingly, I don't know. We'll see.
Do you have a sense of where America goes in terms of its political self-understanding in a post-Trump era?
That's a great question. I don't know that I do, because I think the real question of the next 4, 8, 10, 12 years is going to be if we can ever find a middle again, or if we are truly experiencing this thing that some people like to call like a national divorce. All right. Is there any real overlap of interests and ideologies and cares between very diverse groups that we can all kind of unite around? And if so, who could unite them? And I don't really know for sure how or when that could happen. Trump certainly does not seem to me somebody who acts normally as a unifier. I think he sort of exacerbates whatever differences exist. And so if you're looking for somebody who's going to find that middle or unite Americans in some sort of core identity, restore some sort of American mythos, I don't know if he's going to do that effectively. He certainly does it for his base, but yeah, I'm not really sure. I think at the end of the Trump era, we could end up in a world where people are very, very happy with the things that he's doing, and he, chooses kind of a successor as he goes out, and we end up with a long period of Republican presidents and policies again. Or we could just see the exact same backlash, and maybe we're going to be living in a period of partisan whiplash every 4 years for the foreseeable future. I don't have a good read on which of those is most likely. So,
well, we will find out, I suppose, as the time rolls forward. Well, thank you again for doing this. We've gone about an hour, and it's been very interesting to me. And thank you for entertaining my burning questions.
Yeah.
Tell people where they can find you.
Sure. So Yeah, I have a website that's just philipdbunn.com. I don't use the middle initial to be pretentious. There's another Philip Bunn who's an economist in England, and so I have to avoid being confused with him. That just sort of collects all my various writing. But I also have a Substack that I write on. Sometimes I've been slacking on that, but it's everythingwasbeautiful.substack.com. Kurt Vonnegut quote. I quite like Vonnegut. So yeah, either my website, philipdbunn.com, or everythingwasbeautiful.substack.com. Both of those places you can find the kind of stuff that I write fairly regularly, and some other information about the stuff that I teach and research and publish.
All right. Thank you very much. You'll have to come back now that you've said this about Vonnegut, because we have to argue about him.
Oh, great. I would love that. That would be excellent.
All right. Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you.